Let's talk to a former detective superintendent at Scotland Yard, Shabnam Chaudri now, who joins us to talk about, well, what we have learned in the last 24 hours about that horrific Southport attack that left 3 little girls dead, 8 others wounded with knife wounds, and 2 adults wounded as well. Shabnam, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, good afternoon, Julia.
I mean, look, when we had the guilty pleas from Axel Rudakubana, I mean, it was not just a surprise to the media, it was a surprise, we understand, even to his defence lawyers appointed to represent him in this trial, and certainly seemed to be a bit of a surprise to the authorities. Of course, so much more was able to be learnt about this young man and what he had been doing since it appeared at the age of 12 when things started going horribly wrong. What did you make of what the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, had to say, his statement yesterday, but also particularly in his address to the nation this morning about how, yes, he had known things about him and his links with Prevent and reported to Prevent 3 times and concerns about him and his violent past at school, but there had not been a cover-up. Is that fair for him to say?
Well, in my opinion, as a former detective, yes, I do think that's fair to say, and I think that you cannot afford to jeopardise that trial and such a serious trial, any trial for that matter. So yes, he was very clear that he had been made aware of Rudakubana's background and history at very quickly after, but because of the restrictions around reporting and, in fairness, to have a fair trial, what he's done is called a public inquiry, which I think is really, really good, because the failings in this are absolutely catastrophic, and I think that had there been some joint up agency working with all those various agencies, then this may well have been prevented.
Oh, I mean, 100% could have been prevented. But this is it, whenever there is, and the Prime Minister said, you know, it's not been classed as a terror attack, even though, of course, one of the charges he's actually pleaded guilty to is in itself a terror offence. The fact that he didn't have a clear theology or ideology, you know, is, frankly, I think for most of us, neither here nor there. The fact that he'd been expelled from school, there'd been violence at school, attacking with a hockey stick, arriving at school with a knife, having to be, literally grabbed by teachers at one point. The fact that social workers wouldn't go to his home without police present, referred to Prevent on 3 occasions. Father desperately pleading with a cab driver a week earlier to not take his son to his old high school on the final day at school, where apparently he wanted to perpetrate a massacre. Obsession with genocide, obsession with violence, downloading an Al-Qaeda terror man. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And it's so similar in lots of ways to every other attack where we've seen mass killings, whether it's a terrorist or a madman or a combination of the two. They are known to the authorities, people are fearful of them, there are concerns, but nothing appears to be done. What could have been done to mean that he wasn't on the streets able to do this?
Certainly, I don't know about the on the streets being able to do this, but I think the Prevent calls, the 3 calls that were made over a period of, I think, 17 or 18 months, where then they made the decision that it didn't meet the threshold for intervention. And I think if they'd have met the threshold for intervention, that could have gone a long way.
What is the threshold for intervention? I mean, he talked about, wanting to kill people.
Yeah, I think I'm not a counter-terrorism expert, but what I would say is that they would have looked at what he'd been looking at online, in terms of whether he was looking at other Al-Qaeda or anything like that, or other sites that would indicate that he has some form of terrorist mind. And I think that it may be that Prevent looked at this, and where they get many calls where young people are absolutely obsessed online because they get access online to serious violence or, stuff that is just absolutely beyond the recognition of what any child would be able to have access to. But they may have put it into that kind of category, I don't know. But I think this inquiry will certainly let those details become known at some point.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. A lot of people wonder why we need to have an inquiry in this. Lots of things we don't get an inquiry into, like the grooming gangs, and different reasons given at different times.
We did get an inquiry into the grooming gangs, Julia. We had a 7-year inquiry.
It wasn't into grooming gangs. They spent 10 days doing grooming gangs.
It still touched on grooming gangs. And I think, in fairness now, 7,000 of those victims were spoken to. The ICSA report identified 20 recommendations, and the former previous government did nothing about that.
Completely agree. Utter failings. I'm casting aspersions on everyone involved and their failings, but everyone's got to stop this idea that there was not an investigation to groom gangs. It was touched on very briefly in 10 days. Whistleblowers didn't give evidence. Many victims didn't give evidence. It's a mischaracterisation of the truth, and everyone, if you have to read the report to know and look at the actual hearings on the day. But in terms of this crime, 3 little girls are dead. 8 other little girls have had their lives absolutely turned around. A man and a woman as well who tried to, shield the children. Other children absolutely terrified. I mean, the awful truth is 3 little girls died that day. It could have been 20. It could have been far more. We could have been in a much worse scenario. This is so awful. But there are other people like Axel Rudakubana who are sitting there, bit of a loner, unhappy, maybe got bullied at school, as we're told that might be an issue. Something's going on at home. This could be happening right now in another teenager's bedroom. How do we stop the next one and the next one and the next one?
That's a really good point, actually, that you've raised here. Let's not also forget that David Amos was stabbed 20 times by Ali Harvey, who was also a lone wolf acting alone. These are really difficult individuals to be able to detect.
But again, known to the authorities.
Yeah, if they're known to the authorities, you've got to be able to look into them. And I think that the prevent strategy, systems and processes need a deep dive into that, because there needs to be some changes, some serious reform around that. But very, very difficult to detect. I know that Sir Keir Starmer said this morning that this is a new kind of territory that we're going into. But I don't actually think it's that new, because when we had COVID, there was a lot of talk, and I remember just coming out of policing at that point, about lone wolves acting in their rooms alone, people being radicalised. We had 2 young men last week convicted for neo-Nazi terrorist activity. So this isn't anything really new. There are far too many of these young people that are, not young people, but anybody that is sat in a room alone, isolated, get onto the internet, and then suddenly find themselves absolutely obsessed with this type of activity. It's going to be very, very difficult to detect. And I'm not sure if how they're going to change the threshold.
We're going to need to get better at it, and I suggest we lower the threshold. I mean, certainly kids are being referred to prevent and having action taken for saying something a bit nasty in the playground, for goodness sake, or ignorant in the playground. I think we should be worrying a little bit more about the ones who are obsessed with genocide and stabbings. Shabnam Chaudri, former detective superintendent at Scotland Yard, thank you so much for joining us.